Newsmaker Sunday with Fox 10's John Hook.
He is the most potent voice for moderate Muslims and a potent voice against Muslim extremism. Dr. Zuhdi Jasser is a longtime friend. He's out with a new book. Good to see you, by the way.
Thank you.
He's out with a new book, The Battle for the Soul of Islam. It's a fascinating read, and there's a lot of his own personal story in it. I was taken with how candid you were about your own struggles, even within your family, and how Islam rolls through this. Let's start from the beginning, because you raised some very interesting questions about the battle for the soul of Islam. And you raise a very interesting question. Can a good Muslim be a good American as well? Is there a conflict?
For me, there isn't, but I think for certain versions of Islam, especially political Islam, or those Muslims that believe in the Islamic State that's inspired by their version of Sharia law, I think that is incompatible, because our founding fathers believed in a constitution that was based on an establishment clause in which there was a separation of church and state. And ultimately, if you're a Muslim living in this country and you believe that if Muslims are a majority, you'd want an Islamic state, that means a wholesale change in the system that is Americanism. And growing up in Wisconsin, as I talk about in the book, I felt that, and I was taught by my parents, that I could practice my faith no more freely, no place in the world more freely than in America or in Wisconsin or here in Arizona.
And did you feel that growing up?
Absolutely. But I think a lot of Muslims that believe in the Islamic State, believe in this narrative that America is anti-Muslim, anti-Islam, and is this secular society, would not buy into that.
Then why do Muslims want to come here in big, big numbers?
Again, I think there's two different groups. There's the majority of us that I think come here for political freedom, religious freedom, and because wherever Muslims are a majority, typically it's dictatorship, monarchy, autocracy. Then there's Muslims that come here really just for economic reasons and are really here for evangelical reasons, to spread Muslim Brotherhood concepts, to spread this Islamic State concept. And I think those are the Muslims that are a threat, that don't believe in our system. I don't think they embody the Americanisms that make us who we are as a nation. And I think are really what we're seeing evolve in Egypt with the Muslim Brotherhood takeover, Iranian theocrats, etc. So there's a large population of Muslims out there that are in this battle within ourselves between Westernism or liberalism versus theocracy or Islamism.
The book, Battle for the Soul of Islam by Zuhdi Jasser. Why did you write it? Why did you have to put this down on paper?
It's really about strategy for us as a country. It's about legacy. I end the book with a letter to my children telling them that this is a struggle I've started and many of us have started, but it's theirs to finish. I think Americans now, as we see just this week, 6 arrested in London with a threat to the Olympics on terror charges. We've seen now the Muslim Brotherhood, Islamists believing in an Islamic State taking over Egypt. We see we try to compartmentalize them thinking that it's different issues, but I think it's all the same issue, is can Muslims come to terms with modernity or the separation of mosque and state? And I think until we come through an enlightenment, as the West went through an enlightenment, these are symptoms. Terrorism is a symptom, the Islamic State is a symptom, Hamas, Al-Qaeda, these are all symptoms of an underlying problem where we as Muslims have not, I think, gone through an intellectual revolution of freedom.
You discuss the way America claims to stand for what we're about and how we're viewed in the Arab world is so different, because we stand for freedom, we stand for all of these things, yet we have been complicit in propping up horrible regimes and dictators, and this is why our credibility in the Arab world has suffered so much, correct?
Yeah, and I think one of the themes throughout the book is moral consistency, moral courage, whether it's in our own families, in our own mosque communities, in our countries, or in our government. So when you see an Arab people that know that the worst of humanity is running their government and they're running their militaries, where you see in Syria, where my family came from, tens of thousands now are dying in the streets simply because they want to protest. And you see the American president, Obama, basically saying that we'll let Russia negotiate this, we'll let others deal with this, and we sort of sit on our hands. The Arab street in Syria is not going to have the greatest opinion of our government. And same thing when they see us cozy with the Saudi regime and one of the worst global oppressors of women. And it's hard for the Arab street to have respect for us.
It's a conflicted message.
Exactly.
We were looking at videotape of the Arab Spring. Has this been a good thing on balance?
Absolutely. Out of the gates, absolutely. But the question is, where is it headed? It's a necessary part, because if you look at radical groups from Hamas to Al-Qaeda and the Muslim Brotherhood now that it's trying to, have a facade of moderation, at the end of the day, these are byproducts of dictatorship. Now, dictatorship, which is secular dictatorship, has produced this theocratic dictatorship in the Brotherhood, and as you've seen in Iran with the theocracy there. But ultimately, what happens after a revolution, it can often be hijacked. From the Bolsheviks on, you've seen revolutions
and sometimes
hijacked.
the only organized group is the one you don't want in.
Exactly. So this is why we have to have a strategy. So far, the White House and others have been like a deer in headlights. We just sort of, oh my God, there's this convulsions happening in the Middle East, and we don't have a strategy.
What should we do?
I think ultimately this is why the narrative of so many Muslims like myself is important. What is the lens in which we see it? We need a liberty doctrine in the Middle East. Just as there has been doctrines for, President Bush had a freedom agenda, and every president has a doctrine. I don't know what Obama's doctrine is, but we need, Prime Minister Cameron in the UK said, he talked about the need for a muscular liberalism where we take sides. This is not Islam versus the West or Muslims versus Christians or a sort of a clash of civilizations. It is a battle within the house of Islam. And if we don't take sides, the Islamists, whether it's the Turkish government, the Saudis, or Iranians, are going to take sides with the strongest horse, and Darwinian evolution is going to end up bringing a new dictator and just changing.
Why do you believe we have not taken with clarity, moral clarity, sides?
Because we revolve around an election cycle, John. Unfortunately, we don't have a long vision. The short-term election cycle, as President Obama says, well, I've got 2 months. Last thing I need to, when I'm going to get reelected, is get involved in a conflict in Syria, and he decides to do nothing. So at the end of the day, we're so absorbed. And the same thing about the Muslim issue here with terrorism, etc. One side of America says no Muslim could ever do wrong, and it's all about victimization and discrimination. And the other side says that, well, every Muslim could be a potential terrorist. And in the meantime, the vast majority of Americans are looking for a strategy, and there's no long-term vision because we're focused on election cycles.
Got to take a break here. Dr. Zuhdi Jasser is the author of A Battle for the Soul of Islam. It is a fascinating read and a very personal story, his own story of struggling within his own family about some of these issues. We'll talk about it, and 9/11. What did we learn from 9/11? Back after a moment on Newsmaker Sunday. Dr. Zuhdi Jasser is our guest on Newsmaker Sunday. He's a fascinating guy, a longtime friend, author of A Battle for the Soul of Islam, and he's also the most powerful voice I know for moderate Muslims and the voice against Muslim extremism. Let me turn our attention for a moment to Syria, because your family is from Syria originally, and then they ended up in Lebanon. When you see these pictures, what should we have done?
I think we should have done what we did in Bosnia, what we did in Kosovo, what we did in places of the world where ultimately we saw the free people, we saw movements within these countries that were being completely destroyed by their militaries. Remember, the Syrian equation, as my family so well knew, was totally imbalanced because the military was controlled by the most thuggish of society, the criminals who now are shooting people in the streets that have no weapons. So they need weapons, we need to arm them, we need to give them black ops, intelligence help, and we also need to provide, I think, air support. And ultimately the Free Syria Army is slowly growing, and they're going to topple this regime at some point. It may not be for another 12 months, I don't know how long, but ultimately this regime will go.
So Assad is gone. For all intents and purposes, he's...
But it's not only Assad, that's one of the things. The Egyptian military was a little smarter. They got rid of Mubarak, but they maintained their power structure. The Syrian military is much more consolidated with its intelligence services, and ultimately you have to remove the entire military for Syria to evolve into a democracy.
So for that to happen, you have to have outside help.
You need a complete civil war, you need revolution in which the Free Syria Army is slowly growing. They need arming, they need funds, they need air support. Without that, they will ultimately be snuffed out like every other. I mean, it's happened in Hama. There's been multiple times in Syria in '64 and '82 in which this has happened. I mean, I talk in the book about how there were 19 different presidents of Syria between 1948 and 1963. So ultimately, to get stability there, now you have, I mean, we saw in Eastern Europe. Eastern Europe succeeded after the Soviet Union fell because we invested in democratic movements, in helping the people on the ground create a new infrastructure that the Soviets never gave them. And similarly, I think it's worth our investment for free markets, for opening an economy of over 300 million Arabs that right now has been closed. If we help them, ultimately they will view us as the true beacons of freedom that we are.
You wrote the book in the wake of 9/11. If we could go to tape 3 for a moment. And this is when you created the American Islamic Forum for Democracy. You founded it. 9/11's personal effect on you was what?
It basically was a wake-up call to me that a conflict that I thought would eventually work its way out with generations, including my kids and their kids, and as we got assimilated into American ideals, I realized that there was no time, that ultimately I had to devote every free moment I could and others to try to create a movement that felt that freedom was part of our faith and that radicalism and political Islam needed to be rejected.
Are we safer 11 years later?
No, I think the country is at more peril from radical Islam than it's ever been. And
you really believe that? Because
I do.
everything we hear is that we're safer and that Al-Qaeda's been marginalized and they've really been interrupted and they can't carry out these kind of attacks.
Well, John, you've got the largest agency in government now created after 9/11 that is a whack-a-mole program. That all we're doing, God bless them, the heroes that have been keeping us safe. Fort Hood happened, though, since 9/11, and that I talk about at length in the book.
Right.
But ultimately, it's a whack-a-mole program, and we have no strategy to work with the souls of those Muslims that are being ruptured against Americanism, against freedom, and being pulled into the jihad globally, being pulled into the political Islamic movement that now we see taking over Egypt, that is controlling Iran, controlling a lot of the emerging governments that may, actually you may see terrorism decrease, but I see terrorism as one symptom, one pathway, endpoint of a bigger threat, which is political Islam or the Islamic State that will never be allies with Western secular democracies.
What is it to be Muslim in America?
To be a Muslim to me is being able to worship God at my mosque with my family in Ramadan, which is coming up in only a matter of 2 weeks, in any way that I see is mine, and not dictated by the imams, not dictated by the government. And I think this is the narrative that we are not promoting. Ultimately, we are so hands-off. We are allowing the Islamists to guide the narrative of what it means to be Muslim. And many of these groups in America that have claimed to be the American Muslim representative, whether it's the Council on American Islamic Relations or the Islamic Society of North America, I talk in the book how as a naval officer in uniform, I went to an ISNA convention in 1995, and part of what they thought was freedom was to hold up the U.S. Constitution and say, we want to replace this with the Quran because the Quran is a book of God. And while they're free to do that, to me as a naval officer, I found that not only offensive, but showed the core pathology or the cancer, which is that they could not identify with a system that really allowed us to be more Muslim than their theocratic movement. You
were afraid, I think you were concerned and afraid after 9/11 that as a Muslim you were going to be targeted, that somehow you have a mark on your back then.
Yeah, and the question is, as a community, there's definitely some xenophobia that is evolving in America. And if anything, the groups that claim to speak for us in America have made it worse. There was 33% negative rating of America right after 9/11. Now it's almost 55%. And I think the reason is that big group of Americans in the middle that are fearful, that don't see Muslims solving this. And as long as they don't see the solution to radical Islam via Muslims, they're going to continue to create a wider gap between us.
That was your biggest complaint, and that's why you formed the American Islamic Forum for Democracy, was because there were no voices of Islam calling out what happened on 9/11,
yeah,
and saying what it was and denouncing it. You were really troubled by that.
I was, because it all started actually right after 9/11 in November. The Arizona Republic had a front page story about Muslims torn between loyalty to America and loyalty to Islam. They interviewed imams at mosques in Phoenix and interviewed students who basically blamed America, saying that it was because we had bases in Muslim countries, because, and they even interviewed a student who said the USS Cole bombing was deserved. And I just wanted to jump out of my skin. I called the Republic and they said, well, write an op-ed. I wrote an op-ed that appeared in November 2001, and basically all of a sudden we had so much positive feedback, but also a lot of negative from Islamists, and it opened my eyes to the conflict, in that there are no Muslim, there were very few at the time. Now we've formed a much broader coalition, but at the time in 2001 there were very few organizations of American Muslims that were dedicated to teaching our youth the beauty and synergy of American principles with what it meant to be a Muslim and an American.
So what happens in a mosque? If you go into a mosque in Arizona, what are the teachings like? Is there a radical element in some of these mosques?
Well, I think first we have to, I'm not aware of any mosques in Arizona or Phoenix that are teaching violence or radicalism as far as, anarchy. But the question is, what are the ideas being taught? In my small mosque in Wisconsin, where I went to, my parents built that first small mosque there, to me, Islam was all about spirituality, morality, family values, devotion to country and community. It was very American. And some of the mosques here are teaching that. But others are often giving sermons about how America is anti-Muslim, how Fox and other networks are against us as Muslims, and passing forth these conspiracy theories that are actually false, contrived, but yet getting traction because they collectivize us into a political group rather than a religious group or spiritual group. And I think until we as Muslims recapture from the laity, from the community, our spiritual identity, the imams, who are mostly often political, as we see in some of the mosques here, I've debated them. I mean, Imam Shakairat in Tempe, I've debated him. And rather than deal with the ideas of the threat of Islamism and political Islam, he often will go to personal attacks and say that I'm outside the community and other nonsense, which anybody that knows me and my family knows that we're very committed to the community locally and globally.
You testified before the House Committee on Homeland Security. That was March of last year. You get a letter the night before you're going to testify. From whom, and what was it about?
It was from one of the leaders of the community here. His spouse sent me an email, and basically she invoked my religiosity and said that as a devout Muslim, you should be answering to God and know that the things that you say will be used to target Muslims and may end up killing Muslims, and you should not speak on things you don't know about. So the reason I put that in the book is I want people to understand, when they say, where are the moderate voices, why don't we hear more Muslims speaking out?
Where was the outrage? That's what a lot of Americans said after 9/11. Where's the outrage?
And as a military officer, I said, you know what, that was a psyops, a psychological operation trying to make me not speak out, because I'd be perceived as an Uncle Tom or perceived as somebody working against the community, when in fact it was trying to, at the core, because I love my community, I love my faith, and I'm trying to discuss publicly ideas that I think are leading to the radicalization that we have yet to address. We have not yet invoked any treatments of the core problems that are separating our youth from, I think, what it means to be an American.
Do you feel, and I think this is something Americans are very sensitive to, that the mosques, that there is recruitment and this kind of thing going on in mosques, or that money's being funneled to organizations that want to harm us?
I think, as Chairman King, the Homeland Security Committee, talked about at a mosque in New York, there was an imam who was initially wasn't cooperating, and there are some issues here and there with leaders that may not cooperate, but the vast majority of American Muslims cooperate when they know there's a threat and are working, I think, to report threats of violence. But the problem is not just the violence, it's the ideas that cater to the separatism. And I think this is the culture that we need to change. I think many of those in control, remember, Muslims are not represented by mosques. Mosques are just a place to go worship.
Right.
The vast majority of Muslims actually aren't identified with a mosque. They're part of the business and law and medical and engineering and regular American tax-paying community that is not represented by, you look up in Google Islamic and you're going to find them. And this is where we've forgotten that when we want to look at American Muslims, we're a diverse community. And the lowest hanging fruit syndrome, where we just sort of try to find the imam or whoever, we Muslims have to come together as a diverse population and say, you know what? Imams can teach us religion, but they should not be the ones representing us publicly when it comes to our faith communities.
Dr. Zuhdi Jasser is the author of The Battle for the Soul of Islam. It's his first book. Very interesting stuff. We'll be back with Dr. Jasser in just a moment. Dr. Zuhdi Jasser is our guest this week on Newsmaker Sunday. He is, as I've said before, just a really resonant, important, potent voice in the struggle against Islamic extremism. And his latest book is called The Battle for the Soul of Islam. I want to run, if I can, tape number 5, because you write about the Fort Hood shootings pretty extensively in the book and what it means. This is, again, you know, the ultimate homegrown threat. We've got a guy in our uniform turning on his fellow soldiers.
And it's so important, because I think it's the fulcrum of the book, because you see here, after I give my narrative at the beginning, a guy who is well-to-do, born here, raised here by...
He's you.
Yeah, and his bio looks like mine, and yet he got sucked into this anti-Americanism while he was in uniform. And it wasn't just the imam that conditioned him, it was a whole cultural concept that he was working in an infidel or anti-Islamic military that he needed to fight back against.
This was mainly coming from the internet for him, right?
Well, at the end. But initially it wasn't. I think we have to look at, there were probably some elements within his own family in which initially America was not home. It was sort of part of this Israeli conspiracy and all these other things that I think were part of the soil in which the internet planted its seeds. So we have to remember, if you're going to fix the problem, you have to plant a new seed. And this is what our Muslim Liberty Project does, is we inoculate Muslims with the concept that this type of society, the defeat of the Islamic State, is the best way we're going to get close to God, and that government should be under God but not under Islam.
And that's not inconsistent with the Quran.
That's not mine, not our interpretation. I think the vast majority of Muslims don't want clerics telling them how to read the Quran. They want to have a personal, I mean, Ramadan that we're coming to now is a personal month of reflection between a Muslim and God. The Imam might teach us, might lead a prayer, but it's not theirs to interpret. It's ours to interpret personally. And I talk in the book how even my parents taught me, when I disagreed with them or agreed with them, they taught me that on the Day of Judgment, I will be accountable to God only, not to them, and they won't be there. So that's, I think, the key to society. And, you know, the radicals like Nidal Hassan, I think, look upon themselves as the leaders and the theocrats that want to put forth their versions of Islam.
We've got a couple of minutes left. You say in the book that the problem isn't that most Muslims are extreme. You say they're passive.
This is the issue, is, you know, how many Nazis needed to be Nazis in order to take over Germany? And I think part of the issue is that most Muslims may agree and disagree with radicalism and agree with me, but if they don't start pushing back and leaving legacies of books that talk about the synergy of Islam with and against the Islamic State, we are going to be passively taken over. Just like in Egypt, the Brotherhood won 25% of that vote the first time around, but they ended up being the most organized and winning the runoff election at the end.
About a minute left. What do you want people to take from this book?
Hope that ultimately there's a solution to the problem, and that it is via Muslims, it is via the American experiment, and that everybody has a role to play, not only Muslims, but non-Muslims, media, government, religious interfaith groups. Globally, we need to start a movement for liberty, domestically and abroad, and there is a way to do it via the Muslim community, and we need to take sides in this, I think, the most important battle of the 21st century. For
non-Muslims, what would you like them to know about either the Quran or about the religion that we may have gotten completely wrong?
I think ultimately that most Muslims, 95% of who I was as a Muslim, I had in my consciousness of my ego and my moral character before I could understand Scripture. So you have to remember, most of what Islam is, you bring to the Quran and you'll read it and separate history from religion. So I hope people can look upon that book as there's the radical narrative and then there's the moderate narrative, and we need to find those human beings, those Muslims, that interpret that book in a moderate way and not let the book just be a life in and of itself.
Dr. Jasser, best of luck to you on the book, and continued success, and thanks for everything you do. Back on Newsmaker Sunday next week. Thanks to Dr. Jasser, and we will see you next week on Newsmaker Sunday. Thank you.